This is going to kind of be my little kind of spiel here is going to be a introduction to some aspects of funerary material culture in Egypt during the Roman period, because it's really, really interesting, and you get some really kind of funky things happening. And it's a really interesting place to kind of interrogate aspects of cultural interaction and its material consequences. So what happens when a place like Egypt, which had been a complex state-level society for so long, becomes incorporated into a world empire like Rome, and how does that play out? We're going to be particularly looking at mummy masks, portraits, and funerary shrouds, which are the kinds of these things which are because of Egypt's preservation, we get so much. So I'm going to share my screen here and have a PowerPoint. So here is an image of Egypt, the Roman province. So here's the city of Alexandria, which is the capital. Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire in around 30 BCE, and is a really important part of the Roman Empire after that, because it's a major center of grain production and the like. All these little dots here you see in the Eastern Desert are also mines for precious, both kind of precious metals, but also things like amethyst, and especially special marbles and stone like porphyry, which is this kind of purple, hard purple stone which is used in a lot of construction. Everything you see here, these are all major sites and settlements all along the Nile Valley. And here you see this area. This is called the Fayum, this little kind of leaf-shaped thing sticking off the Nile. And this is actually a region where there's a lot of activity in the Roman period and where we get a lot of material surviving. And so we have a lot of like funerary, all these, especially these mummy portraits come especially from this region right here. So one thing to kind of grapple with when we talk about Egypt, though, is the way that the Roman, on the one hand, the Roman state actually interacts with what's already happening in Egypt. So for example, this is the temple of Hathor at Dendera, which is a sort of a major, well-preserved Egyptian temple in the south of Egypt, exceptionally well-preserved. And you'll see here what you've got is a pharaoh here. He's got a nice little hat on. He's making an offering to the goddess Hathor here, because she's got the cow horns. She's got the little sun disk between them, who's nursing what's probably a baby Horus here, or some version of him. And you've got also a child god here, also probably a version of Horus. You've got the side lock here, and he's also holding his finger up to his mouth. That's a dead giveaway. But like, who is this pharaoh? Who's doing this? If you look in at the hieroglyphs, it says here, autokrator Caesars, that is, it's a Greek rendition of imperator, the Greek autokrator, Caesar in glyphs. And here, Drianus, sort of like this part here. These are some epithets after the fact, but Trajanus, that is Trajan, who's a Roman emperor in the 2nd century CE. So what you have is a Roman emperor putting himself up, or having someone put himself up on this temple, rendered in a completely Egyptian style. Like, I mean, you wouldn't tell, you look at that, if you don't know how to tell the difference between late Egyptian art and earlier Egyptian art, you wouldn't know the difference. But right, you have to like, it's so utterly Egyptian. So the Romans and the Roman emperors fit themselves into a model. They're just like pharaohs now. It's fine. Like, that keeps the priests happy. It keeps the Egyptian elite happy. And that keeps the world running. What happens at lower down is somewhat interesting, as local elites, and that's mostly who we're talking about because it's really nice, fancy stuff we're looking at, try to think about their place in relationship to the wider Mediterranean and also the cultural traditions of Egypt. So let's start with this. So these are 3 mummy cases from a site called Akhmim, which produced a lot of these in the late 19th century and through the course of excavations. And what you have here, they're all date to around the same time, sort of like late 1st century BCE, early 1st century CE. And they're all actually distinctly different. So you have a gold-like mask here. You have this sort of naturalistic or a sort of gesture towards like some representation of like a human skin tone. This is not. Here we have a representation, it's like a gesture towards what a person might have been wearing in life in some kind of way. That this is like not perhaps a toga, but you have basically like a tunic with some sort of wraparound. It could be a chiton, which is kind of a Greek garment. That's kind of, and it's kind of being draped around here. And you've got this here, over here, you have this mesh here is actually a representation of a bead net. We actually find these archaeologically of a vast sort of bead, a sort of blanket that's like a net that's kind of draped over the body. And this is it represented in paint. And you have that here as well with the gesture towards that. And you have here with this, you've got this kind of like, these are called, it's a wesech collar is the name of it. This thing that's like around the neck of the mummy on both of these. And then you also have some very kind of traditional sort of Egyptian funerary imagery here. Here you have Anubis sort of at an embalming with the 4 sons of Horus around him. You have an Osiris figure in the center flanked by various gods. You've got a nice sort of crouching jackal on top of a mummy inside of a like pellet or almost like a cartouche kind of thing there. And here, similar, you have this sort of like kneeling goddess figure with outspread wings, right? So you have a lot of sort of like more explicitly very Egyptianizing imagery on these two. This one, you've gone full sort of naturalistic. The only gesture I can see here, this sort of thing that's very Egyptian, is this nice ankh symbol down here between the feet. So you have, but these are all contemporary, right? These are all like sort of things that people are choosing to do out around the same time, where you can go full sort of like Egyptian sort of mummy as like the luminous sort of transfigured dead. That's what you're getting at with this sort of idea of gold, because in Egyptian literature, funerary literature, the deities are described as having gold skin, silver bones, lapis lazuli eyebrows, very specifically lapis lazuli eyebrows for whatever reason, but their eyebrows are lapis lazuli. Is what we have with that. And here we get something kind of, here we have sort of like a person perhaps is like living, and here it's like something in between where it's like you've gone away from like the luminous gold of the transfigured dead to more like here's a beard, here's the sort of paler skin, but we've also kept all the kind of the magical imagery that we need to get you into the afterlife. These are what are known as the Fayum mummy portraits. And this is a selection of just of several hundred that we have that survive. This is what we would call like naturalistic, perhaps. Not realistic, because I think that gets into all sorts of questions, but certainly it's a tendency towards naturalism, where you're trying to represent the person as they looked when they were alive, perhaps, or some, at least an idealized version of it. And you do get the sense that these are actually individuals too, because you look at this guy we actually know, his name is Eutyches, because his name is here in Greek, actually, in this inscription. This person, if you notice this eye here, it appears that there's some sort of, he must have had some sort of surgery or something to that eye, because like they clearly, that's not a screw up. That's something that like was done intentionally, that this person was recognized by. And you have here, like this woman, I mean, this could look like anything you would perhaps see in, Pompeii, sort of out of Roman wall painting. So you're also engaging with like broader Mediterranean, Greek and Roman traditions of naturalistic painting. If that's not something that comes from the Egyptian tradition. The thing is, however, is like, how are these actually used? They're actually set into mummies like this. So what you have here, this is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So you have, here is the image of this person, but what you have here, like, is the depiction of the deceased here is set into this kind of mummy wrapping. This is what we call a rhomboid mummy wrapping, because of the kind of diamond pattern that's created through it. And so this is something that appears only in around this time, the first to second century CE, under Roman rule. You don't have anything like this prior to it. Now, it's not the only option you had. You could also do, and this is kind of interesting, is that these panel portraits, but there's also things like this. These, yes, that is the correct reaction. I saw that. They're kind of disturbing looking, right? These kind of plaster or cartonnage, which is a kind of paper mache made out of papyrus, masks, and like these are like where they're set onto the mummy, and they kind of look down like that, possibly because the mummies are actually they're in some cases propped up against the walls, so they're kind of looming down. But it's a sort of naturalistic representation of the person, or at least a representation of the person as like a living being. Now comes a real interesting one here. So let's think about these two in comparison. So these are two objects, both from the Fayum, that area I mentioned, sort of that little oasis off the Nile. This is both from, I think this one is possibly from Hawara as well, both dating the same time. This is of Eutyches. This would have been set inside of a mummy. This is a mummy mask of Titus Flavius Demetrius. So he has a Roman name, probably a formerly enslaved person who was granted freedom, or at least his family was, by probably the Emperor Titus, because it's Titus Flavius. You take on the name of whoever granted you freedom or gave you citizenship. And then Demetrius, Greek name. So this person, by being granted this, with this Titus Flavius Demetrius, this person was a Roman citizen living in Egypt, but decided to be buried this way. Now, one last class of funerary objects, which I love, because there aren't that many of them, because Egypt actually preserves things really well, are these funerary shrouds, where you get a really nice mix of what we've just been seeing. For example, this is the funerary shroud of a person named Tasheret Wedjahor. That's her name. How do we know it's her name? It's written here in a version of, and here you can see it again, a version of Egyptian called Demotic. It's basically a highly cursive form of hieroglyphs. It's very chicken scratchy. It's very difficult to read. It's absolutely brutal. But so her name is identified as Tasheret Wedjahor. You've got the naturalistic portrait of the woman here, but then you have like, here's a line, and then boom, we go straight to this Egyptian style of representation. And that's, I think, here because you have essentially two different systems of representation working together. Sort of one that is like a Greek and Roman tradition of naturalistic portraiture, which is communicating one thing. And then you have the Egyptian imagery here, which is doing something else. And this is not unique. There's actually a number of these that survive of a similar type. So this one is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We have something kind of similar. It's not quite that amazing sort of naturalistic portraiture, but again, a representation of a woman in a sort of more contemporary dress, facing front, which is not usual for Egyptian art. Usually you have the profile, right? But then all around, you have Egyptian imagery, and you've got the hieroglyphs here with some very sort of traditional spells. Unfortunately, her name is not preserved. The last one I'm going to show, and they'll just open up for a couple questions, is this, which is, this one's wild because this was actually found in, I think, 2013 or 2017 in the National Museums of Scotland, inside of a brown paper bag that had not been opened since the 1820s. It was bought by a European traveler who discovered this, who has a number of artifacts associated with this thing called the Rind tomb in Thebes, where a number of stuff made it back to Scotland and Great Britain. But this is a little bit strange because what you have is, it's a representation of the god Osiris. He has is flanked by, here is Isis, here's Nephthys, here's some Anubis figures around him. And we know if it's a guy named by the name of Aemka, son of Montsuef and Tanawat, because you have here this inscription. But you look at that face and it is just absolutely wild. Like, it's frontal, it's like this strange kind of shading with the lips. Like, this is sort of like, here you have Osiris being rendered almost naturalistically, which is really, really weird. So you do have these sort of some kind of interesting kind of mixing stylistically here. So this is actually the stuff that I was showing. This was based in part in a day I do in my Archaeology of the Roman Empire class, which I've been teaching this term. So there was a day on funerary material from Roman Egypt, and this was one part of it. There's actually a there's other stuff we look at as well.